She was never supposed to become the one thing he could not control. On the 49th floor of Cross Global, where glass walls framed the Manhattan skyline like a promise made only to the powerful, Ethan Cross signed billion-dollar deals with the same expression he wore to funerals, board meetings, and family dinners. Calm, unreadable, almost cold enough to make silence feel like policy. At 34, he was already the kind of man financial anchors described with admiration and caution, the kind of CEO who could move markets before noon and still make it to a charity gala by 7, every cufflink in place, every word measured. Love, according to Ethan, was the least efficient investment a man could make. It clouded judgment, weakened leverage, and left too much room for disappointment. So when his grandfather's will, the board's rising pressure, and a simmering family dispute cornered him into a choice he hated, Ethan did what he always did under pressure. He looked for terms, not feelings. The answer arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon in the form of a woman who did not belong in his world, and yet somehow seemed untouched by it. Naomi Brooks stepped into the executive conference room, wearing a navy coat still dusted with raindrops, her posture straight, her expression steady, as if she had already decided that whatever happened in that room would not be allowed to diminish her. She was not loud. She was not impressed. She did not glance twice at the skyline, the polished marble, or the men in $1,000 suits pretending not to study her. She simply took the seat across from Ethan and folded her hands in her lap with a quiet dignity that unsettled him more than arrogance ever could. He had expected nervousness. He had expected gratitude. What he found instead was restraint sharpened into grace. The proposal was simple on paper and brutal in spirit. A legal marriage for 18 months, public appearances as needed, full financial protection for her family, and strict privacy once the term ended. In return, Ethan would stabilize his position, satisfy the conditions tied to his inheritance, and silence the speculation that had begun circling Cross Global like sharks in dark water. Naomi listened without interrupting, her eyes moving once from the contract to Ethan's face, as if she were deciding whether the man across from her was honest enough to admit how little this had to do with romance. "You're asking for a wife," she said at last, her voice soft but clear. "But what you really want is a witness who won't betray you." No one in the room spoke. Ethan leaned back, studying her more carefully now. There was no accusation in her tone, only truth, and truth sounded different when spoken by someone with nothing to prove. He told himself that was why he noticed the way she didn't fidget, why he registered the steadiness in her gaze, why the room seemed to lose some of its practiced certainty around her. This would be respectful, he said. It would be clear. No games. Naomi looked down at the final page, then reached for the pen. But before she signed, she wrote one sentence in the margin of the contract in neat, deliberate handwriting. No humiliation. Ethan stared at the words longer than he meant to. For the first time that day, the deal in front of him felt less like a transaction and more like the beginning of something he had not prepared for. Outside, rain slid down the windows in silver lines. Inside, Naomi Brooks signed her name, and without realizing it, Ethan Cross stepped into the first moment of a story he would one day wish had never started as a contract. The wedding took place 11 days later, not in a cathedral or under chandeliers heavy with old money, but in a private room overlooking the East River where everything had been arranged for discretion instead of celebration. The city moved below them in ribbons of yellow light, taxis threading through wet streets, fairy horns sounding in the distance like reminders that life outside this room would continue no matter what promises were made inside it. Naomi stood near the window in a simple ivory dress that fell clean to her ankles, elegant without asking for attention, the kind of dress chosen by a woman who understood the difference between beauty and display. Ethan arrived exactly on time in a charcoal suit, every detail precise, every expression under control. The officiant spoke in a measured voice. Two attorneys remained in the background. A small floral arrangement sat in the center of the table, white roses and eucalyptus, tasteful and almost painfully restrained. There were no vows they had written for each other, no trembling confessions, no family members dabbing tears from their eyes. There were signatures, witnesses, and a ring Ethan slipped onto Naomi's hand with a steadiness that only made the emptiness of the gesture feel sharper. Yet when her fingers brushed his for half a second, Something unfamiliar passed through him, not desire, not tenderness, but a subtle fracture in the clean wall he had built between duty and emotion. Naomi did not smile for the cameras brought in for exactly 4 approved photographs. She only lifted her chin, composed and distant, as if she already understood that this marriage would test not her heart first, but her dignity. By evening she was standing in the penthouse that would now be called home, though nothing about it suggested warmth. The space stretched wide and immaculate above the city, all polished stone, muted art, and floor-to-ceiling glass. It looked less like a place where people lived and more like a magazine spread about power. A house manager showed her the guest wing, the closet prepared with new clothes in her size, the security codes, the dinner schedule, the list of expected public appearances for the next 6 weeks. Everything had been anticipated except the human cost of being absorbed into someone else's life. Ethan found her later in the kitchen pouring herself a glass of water, still wearing the ring as if it weighed more than gold should. For a moment neither of them spoke. The skyline shimmered behind her, and in the reflection on the glass they looked almost like a real couple, standing in the same room at the end of a long day. "If you need anything, speak to Marjorie," he said, referring to the house manager without looking directly at her. Naomi set the glass down gently. "I would rather hear what I need from you." That made him pause. Few people spoke to him without calculation. Fewer still did it calmly. He turned then, meeting her eyes fully, and she saw what most people probably missed beneath the polish and discipline. He was tired. Not physically, but in the way a man becomes tired after years of carrying expectation like armor. "You will have privacy here," he said. "You will be treated with respect." Naomi glanced at the ring, then back at him. Respect is not something people announce. It is something they practice when no one is watching. Ethan said nothing. He should have walked away. He should have filed her words beside every other complication and gone back to the calls waiting on his phone. Instead, he stayed there for 1 beat too long, studying the woman who had entered his life like a clause and was already sounding nothing like one. Later that night, long after the city had softened into midnight, Naomi stood alone in the guest room and opened the drawer of the nightstand. Inside lay a copy of the contract, perfectly aligned beside a velvet ring box and a note typed by an assistant detailing tomorrow's breakfast schedule, wardrobe fitting, and media briefing. Naomi read the note once, folded it, and placed it back with careful hands. Then she looked at the contract, at the sentence she had written into its margin, and at the ring now catching moonlight on her finger. Somewhere in the apartment, beyond walls too expensive to echo, Ethan Cross was still awake too. And though neither of them would have admitted it, the silence between them had already begun to change. By the end of the second week, Naomi had learned that life inside the Cross penthouse moved with the precision of a corporate calendar and the warmth of a museum after closing. Breakfast appeared at 7:30 on the dot. Cars were scheduled to the minute. Invitations arrived already answered. Even the flowers in the entry hall seemed chosen less for beauty than for symmetry. Ethan lived the same way. He left before the city fully woke, returned after dark, and carried silence around him like a tailored coat, expensive, exact, and impossible to wrinkle. Yet Naomi began to notice small things that did not belong to the myth people built around him. He always thanked the driver by name. He read every page before signing. He never raised his voice, even when irritation sharpened his jaw. There was discipline in him, yes, but also exhaustion so deep it had settled into his bones. One Thursday evening, Cross Global hosted a private dinner for investors and press in a restored Upper East Side townhouse, the kind of event where wealth disguised itself as taste and everyone spoke in smooth, careful sentences. Naomi wore a midnight blue gown selected by a stylist, modest and striking at once, the fabric catching light only when she moved. Ethan stood beside her, in a black tuxedo, one hand near the small of her back when cameras turned their way, each gesture practiced enough to look natural. To the room, they were the image of modern power, elegant, self-contained, impossible to read. But beneath that polished surface, Naomi could feel the strain of performing a marriage that did not yet know how to breathe. The evening moved in predictable circles until Ethan's younger sister, Claire, appeared later than expected and looking pale beneath her makeup. Naomi recognized the kind of smile women wore when they were trying not to become the center of concern. During dessert, Claire quietly excused herself. Naomi watched her disappear down the hallway and, after a brief hesitation, followed. She found Claire seated on a bench near the powder room, one hand pressed to her temple, her breathing shallow. "I am fine," Claire said automatically, the way people did when they clearly were not. Naomi crouched beside her instead of standing over her, lowering the temperature of the moment with gentleness rather than alarm. She asked for water, loosened the conversation into something easy, and stayed with her until the color slowly returned to Claire's face. There was nothing dramatic in it, nothing anyone could turn into gossip or spectacle, just one woman choosing calm when another needed it. Ethan came upon them a few minutes later. He had likely been searching for his sister, but he stopped when he saw Naomi seated beside her on that hallway bench, her evening gown pulled around her like dark silk, her voice low and steady. Claire was smiling now, faintly but sincerely, and that alone was enough to alter something in him. Ethan had spent years surrounded by people who knew how to impress, how to flatter, how to position themselves in the orbit of power. Naomi did none of those things. She was not performing kindness for influence. She was simply kind, even in rooms where kindness brought no advantage. She just needed a minute, Naomi said as she stood, smoothing the fabric at her waist. Ethan looked first at Claire, then at Naomi, and for once the answer he gave did not sound prepared. "Thank you." The words were quiet, almost reluctant, as if gratitude itself were a language he had not spoken in some time. On the drive home, the city passed in bands of gold and red. Beyond the tinted windows, Ethan sat beside Naomi in the back seat, closer than they had been in days, yet the distance between them felt less fixed than before. After several blocks, he glanced at her hand resting in her lap, at the wedding ring that had once looked like a symbol of arrangement, and now seemed to carry a meaning neither of them had agreed to. "Claire does not usually trust people quickly," he said. Naomi turned toward him. "Maybe she is tired of people who only know how to look polished." A faint change touched his expression then, not quite a smile, but something warmer than indifference. When they reached the penthouse, Ethan held the elevator door for her, and in that small enclosed space high above Manhattan, surrounded by mirrored walls and soft light, silence no longer felt cold. It felt watchful, fragile, alive. Naomi stepped out first when the doors opened, but she could feel his gaze linger for half a second longer than it should have, as though the woman he married for convenience was quietly becoming the one part of his carefully managed life he could no longer explain away. 3 days later, Naomi learned that in Ethan's world, appearances were never casual, not even on a Sunday. The brunch at his mother's townhouse in Greenwich, Connecticut had been described as intimate, which in the language of powerful families meant fewer than 20 guests, fresh white orchids in every room, and a dining table set with such quiet perfection that even the silverware seemed to understand hierarchy. The drive from Manhattan took just over an hour, long enough for the skyline to fall away behind them and for silence to settle again in the car, though this time it did not feel quite as severe. Naomi watched bare trees blur past the window while Ethan reviewed messages on his phone, his brow faintly drawn, his attention split between business and the private weather of his thoughts. When they arrived, the house rose from the hillside in pale stone and old money confidence, elegant without needing to announce itself. Inside, the air carried the scent of coffee, polished wood, and expensive restraint. Ethan's mother, Vivian Cross, greeted Naomi with flawless manners and cool appraisal, the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes. Claire, however, crossed the room almost immediately and embraced Naomi with a warmth that softened the edges of the afternoon before it had fully begun. It was the first time Naomi realized that her presence in this family was not being measured by everyone the same way. At the table, conversation moved from politics to art acquisitions to the pending merger that had analysts watching cross global with restless interest. Naomi spoke when spoken to, calm and composed, never trying to impress, never shrinking either. Then one of Ethan's uncles, a man who wore entitlement as comfortably as cashmere, asked with false curiosity whether Naomi found it difficult adjusting so suddenly to a life so far removed from where she came from. The table quieted by instinct, everyone recognizing the question beneath the question. Naomi set down her teacup gently. "Adjustment is easier when people value character more than pedigree," she said, her tone respectful. almost serene. Claire lowered her gaze to hide a smile. Vivian's expression tightened by a fraction. Ethan, seated beside Naomi, turned his head slowly toward her, and for a moment the room seemed to sharpen around the stillness between them. It was not just that she had answered well. It was that she had done it without bitterness, without performance, without surrendering an inch of herself. Later, while staff cleared the table, Naomi stepped onto the back terrace for air. The March wind carried a clean chill across the lawn, and the late afternoon light turned the distant trees silver at the edges. She stood there alone for less than a minute before Ethan joined her, closing the door behind him. "You handled that better than most people in this family would have," he said. Naomi folded her arms lightly against the cold. "People reveal themselves when they think they are being subtle." Ethan exhaled a quiet breath that sounded almost like reluctant agreement. From inside came the muted sound of crystal and conversation, but out on the terrace the world felt stripped down to honesty. "You did not have to come today," he said after a pause. Naomi looked out over the lawn. "Neither did you." That drew something close to a real smile from him, brief and almost private. Then his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, and whatever warmth had entered his face disappeared at once. Claire had texted from inside. Their grandfather had suddenly felt unwell upstairs. Within minutes, the polished rhythm of brunch gave way to concern controlled by breeding and habit. Naomi followed Ethan to the second floor, where family members hovered outside the bedroom, each of them trying not to look afraid. A physician who had been called to the house moved with reassuring efficiency and soon made clear that the episode was not serious, only exhaustion and stress. Relief loosened the hallway one breath at a time. Ethan remained near the doorway, tension still visible in his shoulders, and Naomi saw then what no headline ever would. For all his discipline, for all his polished authority, Ethan Cross loved his family in the silent, burdened way of a man who had spent years believing care was best expressed through control. Naomi stepped beside him and said nothing at first. She only stood there, steady as ever, until he seemed to register that he was no longer carrying the moment alone. When he finally looked at her, the distance he had so carefully maintained no longer felt sustainable. It felt fragile. And in that quiet hallway, with evening gathering beyond the windows and the old house holding its breath around them, Ethan began to understand that the woman beside him was not simply fitting into his life. She was changing its temperature. That evening, Manhattan welcomed them back with a cold spring rain that turned the streets below the penthouse into ribbons of reflected gold. Naomi changed out of her coat and found the apartment quieter than usual, as if the long afternoon in Connecticut had followed them home and settled into the corners. She expected Ethan to disappear into his office the way he always did after family obligations, to put distance between himself and anything that felt too personal. Instead, when she entered the kitchen, she found him there without his jacket, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, standing by the counter while the house beyond them glowed in low amber light. A bottle of sparkling water sat open beside two glasses. Nothing about the scene was dramatic, yet something in it felt unfamiliar, almost intimate in the safest and simplest sense of the word. Ethan looked up as she stepped in. "You did not eat much at lunch," he said. "I asked Marjorie to keep dinner light." Naomi glanced toward the stove, where a simple meal had been left warming: grilled salmon, roasted asparagus, and wild rice, not the elaborate formal dishes usually served when appearances mattered. "You noticed?" she asked before she could stop herself. Ethan held her gaze for a second. "I notice more than people think." The answer lingered between them, quiet and precise. They ate at the smaller table near the windows instead of the formal dining room, with the city stretched beneath them and rain tapping softly against the glass. For the first few minutes, they spoke only of practical things. Claire's message saying their grandfather was resting comfortably, a board meeting Ethan would have on Tuesday, a charity event Naomi would need to attend the following week. But something about the hour invited honesty. Perhaps it was the weather, or the exhaustion that follows a day spent inside other people's expectations. Naomi set down her fork and looked out at the skyline. "Your family protects itself by pretending nothing ever hurts," she said. Ethan did not answer immediately. He swirled the water in his glass once, watching the bubbles rise and disappear. "In my family," he said at last, "composure was always treated like proof of strength." Naomi turned back toward him. "And was it?" He gave a faint, humorless smile. Sometimes. Other times it was just another way to avoid being known. The honesty of that surprised even him. Naomi could hear it. So could the silence that followed. In the weeks since the contract had been signed, she had seen discipline, restraint, and control. This was different. This was a man letting one truth slip out unguarded, perhaps because he was too tired to catch it in time. She did not rush to fill the moment. That, more than anything, made Ethan continue. He told her, not everything, but enough. About being trained from a young age to think 3 moves ahead. About inheriting not just wealth, but pressure shaped like legacy. About learning early that affection in powerful families often arrive tied to performance. Naomi listened without interruption, her expression soft but never pitying, and Ethan realized how rare it was to speak without being managed, admired, or challenged. With her, he was simply being heard. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady. "You built your life so carefully that nothing could break it," she said. "But that also means nothing gets in easily." He looked at her then, really looked at the intelligence in her eyes, the calm in her posture, the wedding band catching light as her hand rested near her glass. "And you?" he asked. "What did you build?" Naomi was quiet for a moment. Rain slid down the windows in long silver trails. "Enough dignity," she said, "that I would never have to beg anyone to see my worth." Ethan felt those words settle somewhere deeper than he wanted to admit. Later, when dinner was over, the power flickered once, then went out across half the penthouse, leaving only the city lights and a few emergency lamps glowing in soft gold. Marjorie called to say the building generator would restore full power within the hour. Naomi stood by the window, the outline of her face lit by the storm beyond the glass. Ethan came to stand beside her, not touching, not speaking at first. Below them, Manhattan shimmered through rain like another world. "It is strange," Naomi said, looking out over the darkened avenue. "How something can feel more real when the lights go out." Ethan turned toward her, and in the half-shadow the careful distance between them seemed to lose its authority. There were no cameras, no board members, no family expectations, just the sound of rain, the muted heartbeat of the city, and 2 people standing in the kind of silence that no longer felt empty. "Naomi," he said, her name quieter than usual, almost as if he were testing what it meant when spoken without formality. She looked up at him, and whatever he had meant to say next disappeared. Because in that brief and fragile moment, Ethan understood something he had not seen coming. The woman he had married under terms and conditions was no longer a solution to a problem. She was becoming the one presence in his life that made every carefully written rule feel suddenly incomplete. The charity gala took place the following Friday at a landmark hotel on Fifth Avenue, where crystal chandeliers scattered light across marble floors, and every guest seemed dressed not just for the occasion, but for the cameras waiting beyond it. Naomi arrived on Ethan's arm in a silver-gray gown that moved like quiet water when she walked, refined and understated in a room that rewarded spectacle. Flashbulbs fired the moment they entered. Ethan, as always, gave the press exactly what they were allowed to have: 1 composed look, 1 measured pause, 1 hand placed lightly at Naomi's back. To everyone watching, they appeared polished and united, a marriage settling naturally into public life. But Naomi had begun to understand that appearances around Ethan were often their own form of architecture, elegant, expensive, and designed to conceal as much as they revealed. Inside the ballroom, music drifted low beneath the current of conversation, and the air carried the scent of roses, champagne, and money old enough to become invisible. Naomi moved through the evening with her usual grace, speaking to donors, greeting board members' spouses, and offering precisely the warmth each encounter required without ever seeming false. Ethan noticed all of it. He noticed how quickly people responded to her calm. He noticed how several of his most difficult business associates softened around her. He noticed, with a growing sense of unease, that his attention had long since stopped behaving like something he could govern. At one point, while Naomi spoke with Claire near the auction display, Ethan was intercepted by Victoria Hale, a woman from his past who had once belonged naturally to the world of polished galas and strategic relationships. Victoria was elegant, sharp, and far too comfortable with history. She greeted him with the easy familiarity of someone who assumed old access never truly expired. Ethan kept the exchange brief, but not brief enough. Across the room, Naomi glanced over at the wrong moment and saw Victoria lean in with a smile that suggested knowledge Naomi had never been offered. Minutes later, as the evening continued, Naomi stepped into a quieter hallway near the terrace to breathe away a feeling she could not quite name. She did not intend to overhear anything. But Ethan's voice reached her from the adjoining alcove, low and controlled, speaking to one of the senior board members who had clearly cornered him between events. The arrangement did what it needed to do, Ethan said. She was the right choice. Steady, uncomplicated, no risk of scandal. Naomi stood perfectly still. The rest of the conversation blurred, not because it was louder, but because those words had already done their work. Steady, uncomplicated, the right choice. She knew he was speaking in the language of strategy, the cold vocabulary of a man used to managing consequences before feelings could interfere. But that did not soften the truth inside it. In that instant, every gentle look, every quiet dinner, every unguarded conversation in the dark seemed to shift beneath her feet. She had promised herself from the beginning that she would not mistake respect for affection or proximity for belonging. Yet somewhere between Connecticut and candlelight and rain against the penthouse windows, she had allowed herself to believe that what was changing between them might have been real. Ethan found her 20 minutes later near the ballroom entrance, her expression composed in the way that told him at once something was wrong. "You are leaving?" he asked, reading the small evening bag in her hand, the distance in her eyes. Naomi met his gaze with a stillness that felt almost formal. "I think tonight made the terms very clear." A line appeared between his brows. "Naomi, what does that mean?" She could have asked him to explain. She could have told him what she heard. But dignity had taught her long ago that some answers cost too much when they had to be requested. "It means," she said softly, "that I almost forgot what this was." Before he could stop her, Claire approached from the ballroom, distracted by guests and unaware of the fracture widening in plain sight. Naomi gave Ethan one last look, not angry, not dramatic, only wounded in the quietest and therefore deepest way. Then she turned and walked toward the elevators, her silver-gray gown disappearing into the soft gold light of the corridor. Ethan stood there for a second too long, unsettled by a feeling he had no name for, because he had spent years refusing to need one. Only when the elevator doors closed between them did the truth strike with clean and terrifying precision. For the first time in his carefully structured life, Ethan Cross was not afraid of losing control. He was afraid of losing her. Naomi did not return to the penthouse that night until after midnight, and when she did, she moved through it with the careful quiet of someone refusing to let heartbreak become spectacle. She removed her earrings on the marble vanity in the guest suite, set the ring beside them for one suspended second, then slid it back onto her finger as if even wounded dignity had rules. Across the apartment, Ethan stood alone in his office with the skyline burning beyond the glass and replayed every word he had said in that hallway. He had spoken to a board member in the language he had used for years, detached, strategic, efficient. He had thought he was managing optics. Instead, he had reduced the most human thing in his life to a set of advantages, and for the first time the damage was not theoretical. It had Naomi's face attached to it. He crossed the apartment once, intending to knock on her door, but stopped when he saw the thin line of light beneath it go dark. By morning, she was gone. Not forever, not dramatically, but with enough intention to make absence feel like a sentence. Marjorie informed him at breakfast that Mrs. Cross had left early for Brooklyn and asked that the car not wait. Ethan stared at the untouched coffee in front of him and felt something unfamiliar settle over the room. The penthouse had not grown quieter. It had grown empty. Naomi spent the morning at her mother's apartment in Brooklyn, a modest brownstone unit above a florist shop where the hallways always smelled faintly of lilies and damp earth. It was not grand, but it was honest, and after weeks inside glass towers and curated silence, honesty felt like oxygen. Her mother, Denise Brooks, noticed immediately that something in her daughter had shifted, though Naomi offered only the gentlest version of the truth. "I forgot for a moment that some people know how to be kind without knowing how to love," she said while standing by the kitchen window, watching late morning light fall across the neighboring brick buildings. Denise studied her with the calm wisdom of a woman who had survived enough to recognize pain that did not ask for attention. "Then remember this," she said softly. "A man does not get to borrow your peace just because he is lonely." The word stayed with Naomi all afternoon. Back in Manhattan, Ethan canceled 2 meetings, ignored a string of calls from investor relations, and did something Claire had not seen him do in years. He admitted he had made a mistake before anyone demanded an explanation. Claire was standing in his office doorway when he told her what Naomi had overheard. For once, his voice carried no edge, only frustration aimed entirely at himself. Claire listened, then folded her arms and gave him the kind of look only younger sisters ever master. "You have spent so long speaking like a chief executive that you forgot women are not quarterly strategies," she said. Ethan should have bristled. Instead, he looked out over the city and said nothing, because there was no defense left that did not sound pathetic. By late afternoon, he found himself driving not to the office, not to Connecticut, not to any of the places his life had been organized around, but to Brooklyn. He did not go upstairs when he arrived. He stayed in the town car across from the florist's shop, staring through the rain-specked window at the modest storefront with buckets of daisies and roses arranged outside beneath a striped awning. It was the first place Naomi had ever mentioned with affection, the place where she worked summers as a girl, the place where her mother still helped when extra hands were needed. Ethan watched Naomi emerge just before 5 carrying a crate of unopened boxes, her coat pulled close against the wind, her expression calm in the way that now broke his heart more than tears ever could. She laughed softly at something an older customer said, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and kept moving with that same quiet grace that had unsettled him from the beginning. She was not fragile. She was not waiting to be rescued. She was living, even with disappointment resting somewhere inside her. And standing there unseen, Ethan understood the full humiliation of his own blindness. He had believed he was protecting himself by defining everything in terms of risk. But Naomi had never been the safe option. She had been the truth, and truth was never safe to men who built their lives on control. When she looked up and happened to glance across the street, Ethan instinctively stepped back into the shadow of the car, not from shame alone, but from the sudden certainty that an apology offered too soon would only sound like another attempt to manage outcomes. So he stayed where he was and watched the woman he had married under legal terms move through a world that had shaped her into someone far stronger than the one he had underestimated. By the time the florist's shop lights flicked on against the early evening gray, Ethan had finally named the feeling he had spent days trying not to recognize. It was not guilt. It was not admiration. It was love, and it had arrived too late to feel beautiful. The next morning broke cold and colorless over Manhattan, the kind of gray April sky that made even Fifth Avenue look stripped of certainty. By 8:30, Cross Global was already in crisis. An entertainment site had published photographs from the gala, not the polished ones released by the family office, but grainier images paired with anonymous commentary suggesting Ethan's marriage was a calculated arrangement and Naomi an outsider, chosen for convenience rather than love. Within an hour, business blogs had repeated the story with sharper language. By 9, morning television had turned speculation into narrative. In the executive boardroom on the 49th floor, the atmosphere had the brittle tension of people pretending scandal could still be solved through phrasing. One director insisted silence would allow the story to burn out. Another advised a brief statement about privacy and respect. A third, older and far too comfortable speaking about Naomi as if she were not a person at all, suggested that if she remained out of sight for several days, public interest would move on. Ethan sat at the head of the table, listening as though the conversation were happening from very far away. Then one of the legal advisors slid a draft response across the polished wood. It described the marriage as private, mutually beneficial, and not subject to public interpretation. Mutually beneficial. Ethan stared at the phrase and felt sudden disgust rise clean and sharp through years of learned control. Around the table, voices continued, discussing brand stability, shareholder confidence, and reputation management. But for the first time in his adult life, Ethan heard the ugliness beneath the polished language. They were asking him to protect the company by allowing Naomi to be reduced once again to a useful arrangement. Claire, seated midway down the table as an observer from the family trust, watched her brother's face change by degrees. It was not dramatic. Ethan did not shout. He did not slam a hand against the table. The silence he finally imposed was worse, because everyone in the room understood it did not belong to the chief executive they knew. It belonged to a man reaching the edge of what he was willing to sacrifice. "No," he said, and the single word cut through the room with more force than volume ever could. One of the directors attempted a careful smile. "Ethan, this is only temporary positioning." Ethan pushed the drafted statement back across the table without looking at it again. "She is not positioning." The room went still. For a moment, even the city beyond the glass seemed to pause with them. Helicopters suspended in the pale distance, traffic muting itself below. Ethan rose from his chair with the unhurried control that had always made people underestimate the finality of his decisions. "There will be a statement," he said, "but it will not describe my wife as if she were an asset class." He looked at each member of the board in turn, and for the first time none of them saw the polished strategist they depended on. They saw a man willing to let the structure shake if truth required it. 40 minutes later, cameras gathered in the lobby of Cross Global after an unscheduled press alert drew every major outlet within reach. Naomi, meanwhile, stood behind the counter of the florist shop in Brooklyn, trimming stems in clean morning light, unaware that across the East River Ethan was walking toward a bank of microphones with no prepared script in his hand. Claire had called once, only once, and told her to turn on the small television mounted near the register. Denise reached for the remote while Naomi stood frozen, one hand still wrapped around a bundle of white roses. Then Ethan appeared on screen in a dark suit and plain tie, no practiced smile, no legal team visible at his shoulder. The lobby behind him gleamed with the same power it always had, but he looked strangely separate from it, as if he had stepped out of one life and into another without warning. When reporters began shouting questions, he raised a hand, not to command them, but to quiet the noise long enough for truth to survive it. "My marriage is real in the only way that matters," he said, his voice steady and carrying through the lobby and into the little florist shop where Naomi could barely breathe. "It began for reasons I understood far too well at the time, reasons rooted in duty, pressure, and fear. But the woman at the center of these stories is not a transaction, not a strategy, and not the explanation anyone is owed for my failures." He paused, and the entire city seemed to lean toward the screen. "Naomi Brooks is the most honorable person I have ever known. If there is anything cold or calculated in this situation, it came from me, not from her. I will not allow her dignity to be traded for public comfort or corporate ease." Somewhere behind the cameras, someone tried to interrupt with a question about shareholder fallout. Ethan did not even glance in that direction. "Then let there be fallout," he said. In the florist shop, Naomi stared at the screen with tears she would never have allowed in public gathering quietly in her eyes, not because he had defended her, but because for the first time he had chosen truth without hiding behind power. And as Ethan stood there before the whole city, risking reputation, legacy, and every carefully managed advantage he had built, Naomi understood that whatever came next, the man speaking now was no longer protecting a contract. He was fighting for her. By late afternoon, the city had already moved on to its next distraction, but Naomi had not. Ethan's words still lingered in the florist shop long after the television had gone dark, settling into the quiet spaces between bouquets, receipts, and the faint perfume of fresh roses. Denise said nothing at first. She only reached across the counter and squeezed her daughter's hand with the kind of tenderness that asked no questions and demanded no performance. Naomi stood very still, the white roses still gathered loosely in her arms, and realized that what shook her was not the public defense itself. It was the fact that Ethan had finally spoken without the armor of strategy. For the first time since this impossible marriage began, he had not chosen the safest version of the truth. He had chosen the most costly one. Just after 6, as rain threatened again over Brooklyn and the sky dimmed into soft gray, a black town car pulled to the curb outside the florist shop. Ethan stepped out alone, no driver waiting at the wheel, no assistant, no security detail hovering near the door. He wore the same dark suit from the press statement, but the man inside it looked different now, less polished, more human, as if one honest decision had stripped away something he could never fully put back on. Naomi saw him through the front window before he entered, and for one Suspended second, neither of them moved. Then the bell above the shop door rang softly, and Ethan walked in carrying nothing but a folded envelope in one hand and the weight of everything he had come to say in his eyes. Denise, with the wisdom of a woman who knew when a moment belonged to two people alone, removed her apron and disappeared into the back room without a word. Ethan stopped a few feet from Naomi, surrounded by buckets of hydrangeas, tulips, and peonies in every shade of spring. It was almost absurd. The most powerful man in Manhattan standing in a modest Brooklyn flower shop looking as uncertain as any ordinary man in love. "You should not have had to hear the truth about my fear disguised as logic," he said, his voice low and unguarded. Naomi did not rush to rescue him from the discomfort. "No," she answered softly. "I should not have." He nodded once, accepting the wound without defending it. Then he handed her the envelope. Inside was the original contract, the paper slightly creased now, the elegant legal language still cold on the page. Naomi looked up at him, and Ethan, without breaking her gaze, took the contract back from her hands. Then, slowly and with absolute clarity, he tore it in half. And then in half again. The sound of paper separating seemed strangely loud in the little shop, like the breaking of something that had ruled both their lives longer than it should have. Ethan let the pieces fall into the nearby wastebasket. "I do not want one more day with you to belong to terms I wrote when I was still trying to protect myself from everything real," he said. Naomi's breath caught, not because the gesture was dramatic, but because it was not. It was simple, clean, final. Outside, the first drops of rain began tapping against the window. Inside, the room held its breath. Ethan stepped closer, though still not close enough to presume forgiveness. "I cannot promise perfection," he said. "I cannot promise I will always know the right thing to say before I say the wrong one. But I can promise this. If you ever choose to stand beside me again, it will not be because you were convenient. It will not be because my family expected it, or because the board approved it, or because a clause made it easier. It will be because I love you. Fully. Publicly. Without conditions." Naomi felt tears gather, not from weakness, but from the unbearable relief of hearing the one thing her dignity had refused to beg for. She looked at the rain streaking the shop window, at the discarded contract, at the man before her who had once seemed carved from ambition and now stood there with nothing but truth. "You really frightened yourself, did you not?" she asked, and Ethan let out the smallest breath of laughter, quiet and humbled. "Completely," he admitted. That was when Naomi closed the last distance between them, not rushing, not dramatic, just sure. She placed her hand over his, and the wedding ring caught the fading light between them. "Then let us begin with honesty this time," she said. A month later, beneath strings of warm lights in the small community garden behind the Brooklyn brownstone, Ethan and Naomi stood before family, close friends, and rows of spring flowers opening beneath the evening sky. Claire cried openly without apology. Denise smiled through shining eyes. Even Vivian Cross, composed as ever, seemed changed by the quiet grace of the moment. Naomi wore a simple ivory dress. Ethan looked at her as if every mile of Manhattan, every boardroom, every polished room he had ever conquered had only been leading him here. There were no attorneys, no witnesses chosen for legal formality, no hidden terms. When he placed a new ring beside the first, his hand trembled just enough to tell the truth words could not. And when Naomi said yes again, the city beyond them kept glowing, taxis moving, trains passing, skyscrapers burning against the night. But none of it felt larger than this small circle of light, where power had finally made room for love. In the end, Ethan Cross did not lose his empire by telling the truth. He only lost the part of himself that had mistaken control for strength. And Naomi Brooks, who had entered his life as a solution written in ink, became the woman who taught him that the only promises worth keeping are the ones made freely, with nothing left to hide.